So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our exciting introductory class on Daniel. Tonight, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what we're discussing and how we're going to discuss Daniel, so that you can and kind of an inkling about the difficulties of this book and how we're going to address them. So please, anyone who can turn your cameras on, please turn your cameras on. Please mute yourselves unless you have a question. If you have a question, please feel free. So Daniel, what's the challenge of Daniel? The challenge of Daniel is that it's a book that there's no way other than to look at it as a book in parts. Because the first section are these kind of court stories about Daniel as a Jew in a foreign court, as a Jew interpreting visions. And then the second part are the actual visions of Daniel as regards the future of the Jews within the kingdoms, the future of the kingdoms, but really much more as they pertain to Jews. And what we find is, and it's also hard not to see this as kind of a composite book, because it switches from Hebrew to Aramaic and then back to Hebrew, which is nice that when we get the Hebrew, it's kind of a relief. I'll share my screen for a bit and I'll show you what I mean. So if we look here at the beginning of Daniel, we start in Hebrew, B'shnat Shalosh L'Machot Yoyakim, right? We start in Hebrew. We have Hebrew for a whole chapter, really nice. We're all relaxed. And then the second one, we start with Hebrew. We're like, great, another chapter of Hebrew. No, because you go, and what's funny is it gives you an excuse why he's switching to Aramaic. The king says to his wise men, he says, I dreamed a dream. Chalom chalamti, I dreamed a dream. Vatipa'em ruchi ladat et hachalom, my spirit is troubled to know the dream. And then it says that the Kasdim, the Babylonians answered the king in Aramaic, in Aramaic. From there on, you're in Aramaic land. That's it. You have switched to Aramaic. You're not going to breathe. You're not going to come out of this until chapter 8, right? So you are now in Aramaic for the rest of the stories and for the first of Daniel's visions. Okay, so we have numerous divisions. In other words, we have, so if we're just talking about, let's talk about language and genre divisions in this book, okay? So first chapter, story about Daniel being brought with the other young men. We're going to talk a little bit about ancient Near Eastern parallels, actually to this chapter specifically. We have a very interesting parallel there. Daniel being brought with his friends to Babylonian, how they deal with the problem of food, right? And then in the next chapter, Daniel already has to interpret a dream. He doesn't have to just interpret the dream. He has to say what the dream was, which everyone kind of acknowledges is pretty impossible. And they're trying to tell the king, Your Majesty, that's kind of impossible. But he's a typical king dictator. He's like, I don't give a damn if it's impossible. You say you're magicians. You say you know things. Tell me what the dream was. And of course, they're stuck until Daniel comes along, right? And then Daniel interprets visions and kind of causes a general recognition of God, right, by a series of kings, okay? Until we get to chapter 7. In chapter 7, things switch. It switches from stories about dealing with not just, like, on the one hand, life in a foreign court, and on the other hand, the non-believing kings, right? And can everyone see my screen, by the way? Can everyone see the Daniel chapter that I've got on? Okay, good. And then it switches to Daniel's vision. It's still in Aramaic, and we have our first vision, okay? And this first vision is talking about the kingdoms as beasts. We already had a vision in the stories. We already had a dream about a great statue, right, made of different materials that represented kingdoms, and that's actually a kind of a trope almost in certain stories. I believe Babylonian stories, but we'll go into it when we get to that chapter. And here we're talking about them as animals, and we have these kind of weird horns, right? And there's a little horn that's really kind of full of itself and kind of heretical. That little horn seems to represent Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Antiochus, the fourth, who made all those decrees, right? And that's what this first vision is about. And in fact, it's followed up. And then from there on, we switch into Hebrew. Okay, we switch into Hebrew, and we have another vision, which also seems to be talking about, that's where all these visions, except the last one, they all seem to culminate in this idea of kind of Antiochus and what happens following Antiochus. Now, because of this, these visions are generally seen as being composed as a reaction to Antiochus Epiphanes. In other words, they're being composed as a way of saying this was all foretold. All of this was foretold, including this crappiness, and then we're going to get a kind of a messianic figure who's going to help us. We're going to be redeemed. We're going to be saved. Okay, and that's what these visions are about. All right, so these visions in general are connected to the Maccabean / Hasmonean period, right? This is the Maccabean revolt. And then in the last vision, we actually get to what you would call more classically an apocalypse. An apocalypse, when we talk about apocalypse, these are stories that end in this kind of, it ends with the future age. It's not really an apocalypse because things aren't necessarily all destroyed, right? But you see here at the end, it ends with Tchiyat HaMetim. It ends with the resurrection of the dead, right? So it's this kind of, this is the future time, all right? Not just something that, and so this kind of falls into the genre of what's called apocalypses. I think that they're rethinking this genre now because it's kind of it's an artificial modern genre definition that they're kind of putting ancient stuff into. So I don't want to lose you. What does all this mean? Why do we care? All right. Why do we care? So first of all, it gives us an entry point into learning Daniel, into understanding what this book is about. Okay. So the first part of Daniel is court stories, which seem to not be actually reflecting Hasmonean period. It seems to predate that. These seem to be stories. So in other words, we're talking about 1 through 6, right? Are stories that are talking about, now maybe not the statue one, right? But in general, they seem to be stories that are dealing with the I see there's a question, but just a second. They're dealing with what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora under rule of a foreign king and serving in a foreign court. How do you handle the requirements of Judaism, and how do you handle the fact that you believe in a God that they don't? And what is the strength of God? What is the power of God in these foreign lands with these foreign kings, with these powerful foreign kings? And the answer is the answer seemed to be, I'm kind of summarizing, the answer seemed to be, you can do it, right? You can, if you hold true to God, you will be able to, let's say, keep the laws of kashrut. You'll be able to stay pure, quote unquote, because God will help you out by letting kind of the Gentiles help you out. And you will also, God has power over these kings. Eventually, he has power over everything. Eventually, these kings will recognize the power of God, right? They should recognize the power of God. Okay, and that's these stories. And when we delve kind of deeper into them, we're going to talk about how they fit into kind of the whole genre of stories of Jewish court stories, right? Like that's Esther, and there's Achikar, which we never really talk about. but those are two other stories of court Jews, right? A Jew who's going to a foreign court and he's representing the God of Israel, and he also himself has to kind of stay a Jew. And what we find actually is in this first chapter that some of the things that Daniel does are things that are then attributed to Esther by the Midrash, right? So when Daniel makes an effort to keep kosher, so the question is, well, how did Esther keep kosher? Well, she did what Daniel did. That's kind of what the Midrash tells us, right? And so those are the court stories. And then what happened was, in the time of the revolt, you had people creating, Daniel was already a known character, right? And they're saying Daniel had these visions. And then those visions were appended to the collection of stories about Daniel. Now, that's not really unusual, particularly in the Second Temple period. There's a book called Enoch, Hanoch, and that's exactly how it works. You've got all sorts of stories and visions of Enoch, and they're all kind of combined into one big book. Anything that had Enoch as a main character is put in that book, but some of them are from different periods of time. They have different genres. You have things that are stories, you have things that are visions, you have things that are wisdom literature, right? And they're all put together, right? And the idea is it makes sense, because if they're all concerning Enoch, we should have a book of Enoch. These are all concerning Daniel, they should have a book of Daniel. But the way we need to read these stories, essentially, if we want to look at them in a way that, and I like to look at them kind of what was the original intent. Now, is to kind of look at them in terms of the period and the circumstances in which they're composed and what they're reacting to, right? Now, I'll admit, there are absolutely cases where there are analysis of a story and saying this piece came from here, and then this verse was added, and that verse was added. I'm not always going to reflect that, because sometimes all it does is just sucks the meaning out of the story. And I cannot stand that. I don't see the point in teaching something that sucks all the meaning out and that no one's going to remember anyway. If there's something that's really relevant, I will bring it up. Okay, I'm taking a pause now, and I see there's a chat. Okay, so Moshe Matitya says, I'd imagine that for the original readers of Daniel, it was the switch to Aramaic that was a relief. Well, you know, Moshe, I think it's interesting because in Judea, they are writing and reading Hebrew. Like, if you're talking about, I mean, it is also, admittedly, it's also a statement. The fact that you're writing and reading Hebrew in the Hasmonean period is a statement, right? We are Israel. We are not a foreign power. we're not speaking a foreign language. We are speaking language of the Bible. I think even then there was that stance. But I think you're right that certainly for a contemporary, certainly in Babylonia, that the switch to Aramaic was like, yeah, I get this, right? And it's kind of funny that it gives you an excuse for why switching to Aramaic. It's like, well, they answered him in Aramaic, so from now on, we're going to be in Aramaic. That's it. Now it's in Aramaic. Okay, so what date do scholars estimate for the book of Daniel being written? So I don't know of an exact date that they have for the stories. I'll give you I'll look it up. I'll give you some, because there are also a lot of different ideas about it. For the second part, they really do, the earliest it could be is Antiochus's decrees, essentially. So Antiochus's decrees are 167. Yehuda Maccabee dies in 160. Right, so I think they probably put it at between 167 to 160. I have to check if that holds true for all the parts. That would be the second. That would be the second half. The first half would be dated earlier than that. And what's interesting is that there are a lot of places where the stories in the first part of Daniel do seem to draw on certain tropes that were common in Babylonian, not even just Babylonian stories. Actually, I'll wait if there are any more questions about Daniel as a book before we kind of start with the first chapter to kind of give you guys a taste. I can see it's late for some of you. I'm sorry about this. I'm really sorry about the delay also. So if there are no more questions, I'll just kind of delve into the book. Now, I also do, actually, before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about Daniel in terms of Daniel's place in the corporate. One more thing. Sorry, before I forget. Besides teaching the book of Daniel that we have in the Masoretic text, I'm also going to go over the additions to Daniel that we find in the Septuagint. Those additions are not considered necessarily late in terms of their original composition. It's clear that they were added fairly late because they're in the Septuagint. They aren't in the Masoretic text. So I assume that one can assume that they were added to this book in Alexandria. I would imagine. But their composition could have very well long predated it. Those are the stories. There's one which is prayer. The other two are, if you've ever heard of Susanna, the story of Susanna, Shoshana, right, where there are a couple of lecherous men who set her up essentially to die, even though she is virtuous, and Daniel saves her by showing that they are false witnesses. And the other, which is Bel and the Dragon, and that kind of is showing the ridiculousness of idolatry. That's where Daniel is kind of demonstrating the ridiculousness of idolatry. What's interesting is that those stories are so different from the others in terms of their main kind of bent and their tone. So it could be that they were left out of the Masoretic text because they didn't quite jive with the other stories, which are all kind of match a little bit better. Or simply they just weren't appended to that collection, but in the Septuagint they are. So we'll either address those, we might address those after we do the whole book, or I might address them after we do the stories just because they match the stories.
Miriam?
Yes.
Was there a question whether or not to include Daniel in the Bible?
So it's not really presented that way. What's interesting is, and a couple of things, another thing I want to point out. You may have heard me talk about Yechezkel, when Yechezkel is giving examples of righteous people who are not able to save everyone around them, because Yechezkel is making a point that that each person can only save him or herself by their good deeds or damn themselves by their bad deeds. They don't save, there's no collective punishment or collective salvation. So he says, and he gives these examples, Noah, Eov, and Daniel. And in the Masoretic text, we have a kriyuch. It's read differently than it's written, and it's read Daniel. Why? Because we don't know who the heck Daniel is, and we know who Daniel is, so they read it as Daniel. Okay, now it's not Daniel, it's Daniel, because Yechezkel's whole point is he's using examples of righteous Gentiles. He's saying this is the way God runs his whole world. So he takes Noah, righteous Gentile, Eov, righteous Gentile, and Daniel, who was a known figure, a classic righteous judge. So he was a known figure. We have him in Ugaritic narrative. And so he used Daniel as an example also of three righteous Gentiles who, even if you had them, they would save themselves and not anyone around them. Robin, as always, I appreciate your background. I don't want to not mention it. So back to Daniel. So no, this is what I always say about what made it into the Judean Bible. What made it into the Judean Bible, obviously, first of all, people had to take it seriously. It had to be considered, like, it's mushy, right? Because you could say, well, no, but people didn't accept Jubilees, people didn't accept Enoch. Both of those date themselves to very early. But they were, I just think of them as too weird. They were too weird. People didn't really believe in them, right? Whereas Daniel, it's interesting to us because it's so clearly these kind of court tales. It matches very well with Esther, and but Daniel the book places itself clearly in the Babylonian exile, which means it's during the time that traditionally you still have Ruach HaKodesh, you still have books that are inspired by, you could say, the Holy Spirit, the spirit of prophecy, right? So they're not prophets, so Daniel is not considered a prophet, right? But it's considered to be inspired, right? Divinely inspired. It can be a divinely inspired book. Whereas if that book had placed itself after the return to Zion, such as the book of Ben Sira. The book of Ben Sira places itself very clearly after that. People knew when Ben Sira lived. So it could not be part of the Judean Masoretic Bible because clearly it's not divinely inspired. They love the book. They all know the book by heart, but it's not part of the Bible. It couldn't be divinely inspired. But this book, it's Daniel, and Daniel is in exile. So we know that if you take the Masoretic book's word for it, this book is from before the return to Zion, and therefore can be legitimately considered divinely inspired. Okay. And so Susan asked, the reference to Daniel in Ezekiel is a reference to a Gentile. Yes, that is what I'm saying. And you can see from the context, because it's three people. He names three people. He names Eov, he names Noach, and he names Daniel. So and otherwise, because if you read it as Daniel, I mean, obviously you can always come up with some sort of explanation, but he doesn't fit. Daniel doesn't fit in that group of three. Okay, so right. So, but Daniel does not seem, and that's what, whenever someone says to me, why weren't Jubilees in, why wasn't Enoch in, I say, it's pretty easy to see why they weren't in, because they were pretty nutty books. What's weird is that Daniel made it in, because Daniel has a bit of that kind of nuttiness, with the horns and stuff. It's a little bit, it's kind of a little crazy, but it did make it in. And I think because, I think probably already, by the time of the Judean Bible being more or less closed, I think people were already inspired by the prophecies in Daniel. That's my guess. My guess is that they were already kind of looking to those prophecies and saying, this is really important. This is something that means that things will be okay. So Moshe Matitya asks, weren't there Jewish books groups in the Second Temple period which did consider Enoch and Jubilees to be very central and important books? Yes, especially of Jubilees. It seems like, and again, here I kind of disagree with Kana Verman. Kana Verman wants to say that Jubilees was composed by the Dead Sea sect. I don't think that's true. I think it doesn't have sectarian language. It really is not, the attitude in Jubilees is not that of the Dead Sea sect. And so I don't think that's true. I think it's clearly part of a larger group. They did find copies of it. Just whenever you have one of these books that also survive in what we call pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha literally means books written under a fake name. That's what pseudepigrapha means literally. But we use the name in English, right? In Hebrew, it's super convenient, because in Hebrew, all you have to say for apocrypha and pseudepigrapha is Sfarim Chitzoniyim, external books. Books external to the Bible, they are what they say, you know exactly what they mean. You don't have to go into this whole rigmarole every single time you say the word. But in English, we use the word apocrypha to mean books that made it into Septuagint, but not the Hebrew Bible. We use pseudepigrapha to mean books that were kept by some Christian church somewhere, right? Didn't make it into the apocrypha and didn't make it into the Jewish Bible. So Enoch and Jubilees were both, first of all, apparently they were originally, Enoch was probably written in Aramaic, then translated into Greek. Jubilees probably written in Hebrew, then translated into Greek. Then they were both translated into Ethiopic and kept by the Ethiopian church, right? So they're in Ge'ez in their entirety. Enoch has a piece that we have in Greek, but in their entirety, we essentially read them in Ge'ez, which is itself translated so many times, it's been transmitted, but these are a major part of the Ethiopian canon. And so sometimes you'll actually see paintings in that Ethiopian style of scenes from Jubilees, right? It's part of the canon. Or I met an Ethiopian guy who was named Chanoch, and I wondered if it was because Chanoch is so much more important in Ethiopia, right? So we have that. But those books were clear. So these books, the fact that these books were actually transmitted to some Christian groups, and Enoch, the church fathers even knew about, shows that there were numerous Jewish groups who thought these books were very important. One of the arguments of why these books weren't included in the Jewish Bible is that the Jubilees, for example, uses a solar calendar, so that would not be okay. Enoch also argues for a solar calendar, even though at the point where the guy's writing to argue about it, he's actually kind of forgotten the arguments. I did a commentary on Enoch once, and I wrote it. It's in this Outside the Bible series, and it's just a mess. The calendrical part in Enoch is a mess because the guy didn't know what he was doing anymore. Like, he starts trying to show how it works, and then he realizes he's using like the wrong model, and he just stops midway. He just stops. So both of those books are really strange, actually. They're both pretty weird books. For anyone who's interested, Robin has put that link to Daniel in the chat. So a link to a Wikipedia entry on Daniel. Okay, so back to Danielle, and I will share my screen. Any more questions before I start? Okay, great. So guys, this was a little dry. It'll be a little bit more interesting as we move forward. Okay. Again, anyone who can, please turn on your screens. Here we go. Okay. So let's go to chapter 1 in lovely Hebrew. Now this doesn't quite work time-wise, but we're not going to get into it now. The third year of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged it, and it says, and God gave Joachim, the king of Yehuda, into his hand, et cetera, et cetera. And he took the vessels of the temple. Now, Vayomer Hamelech Lashpenaz Rav Sarisav Lahavi Mibnei Israel Umezer Hamucha Umin Hapartamim. So the king said to Ashpenaz, the head of his officers, it's not necessarily eunuchs here, to bring the children of Israel and from the children of the royal children and from the nobles, Yiladim asher ein behem kol mum v'tovei mar'eh u'maskilim b'chol chochma. Children who have no blemish and are good looking and are smart with every wisdom. They know knowledge, they understand possibly logic, that are strong, to stand in the king's palace, and they're going to learn. It's not clear what that means to learn. Are they going to learn books? Or are they going to learn to be scribes? Possibly, and to learn the language of the Babylonians. So the king said, okay, give them your daily rations, right? From the king's, essentially from the king's table. The king's going to give them their rations and wine. And to raise them for 3 years. Where are we? Hold on, excuse me. To raise them for 3 years. Here we are. And so at Miksatam is at the Katseh, at the edge of those years. At the end of those years, they will stand before the king. All right. Okay, so what's the parallel here? Oh, by the way, one final check. Is this microphone making me sound like Mickey Mouse, or do I sound normal?
You sound fine.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. I just had to check. Thanks. Okay. So what's the parallel here that I've been kind of hinting to? Shalom Paul actually pointed this out in an article. The article is in Hebrew. So I was looking for these letters in English, and I couldn't find the letter in English. I could only find the letter with this Hebrew translation. So there's a letter, one of the Mari letters, So the Mari letters, you guys have probably heard about the Mari letters. So they're, and certainly if you studied with me before, you have, right? So they're discovered that they include a whole bunch of, usually they use them to understand the relations between kingdoms. Under Zimri Lim, who was married to Shibtu. Now this is a long time before the story of Daniel. It's 1775 to 1761 BCE, right? 1775 to 1761 BCE. So just as comparison, right? The first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE, right? So you're talking over 1,000 years difference, 1,000 years earlier. But Zimri Lim writes to Shibtu, his wife. He says, you know, of those captives, I want you to take 30 of the women who are weaving, who are beautiful, who have no blemish, who are beautiful and have no blemish. I want you to take them and they are going to learn to sing. They're going to learn our style songs. They're going to learn to sing. We're going to change their status to status of singers, okay? And I want you to keep them fed because I want them to look healthy, he says, okay? So Shalom Paul points out that there are numerous parallels actually to our story here. Let's go over them. I will once more share my screen. So here we have, we're in the right chapter, yes. So what does he do? He says, he gives, he tells them who will take them by name, right? Who's going to be in charge of them by name. So they do the same thing here. He says Ashpenaz, he names Ashpenaz, who's going to be the person in charge of this, right? The whole thing that they have no blemish is also found in that letter, right? The idea that they have some kind of skill, right? These are wise and those were weavers, right? And they're going to be taught something else, right? And also, of course, that they must get rations. And as we'll see later, part of the issue of rations here as well is that they must look healthy, right? That's part of the reason that they that not just they're being fed, obviously they're being fed, otherwise they die, but that you have to pay attention to their rations to make sure that they're eating enough to look healthy, okay? So let's come back to our story. So what does that mean actually, that we have these parallels? It means that these stories and court stories, generally, and especially the stories in Daniel, they do seem to be part of kind of a tradition of court stories, not just among Jewish court stories, which of course we have, but also among a wider Babylonian, Syrian court stories. And these court stories frequently reflect actual behavior and actual ways things worked in court, right? And this is what we're seeing here, is that this makes sense, right? That this is something that would happen. You bring these children, you choose good-looking children, right? That have no blemish, and you'll train them and you give them rations, okay? And train them to do something else. So who are our characters here? Yehuda, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are the young children of Judea that are coming. Of Judah, I should say. He gives them different names. Daniel Belshazzar, Hananiah Shadrach, Mishael Meshach, Azariah Abednego. Right? Why is he giving them different names? Possibly to show this is what it means to be in a foreign land, is to take foreign names. But also, even though, I mean, we know from the Babylonian, what we found from the Babylonian town of Yodea, right? That we found in Babylon where the Jews were, that's actually how you can tell they were Jews. They kept Jewish names, which is interesting. Like, this is the first thing they get are non-Jewish names, but we know that actually that's one of the things that they kept were their names. Moshe Matijah says on the Harot Bavel also seems on the rivers of by the rivers of Babylon also seems to describe Judean captives who are instructed to play Judean music for their captors. That's right. That's true. That is actually an interesting parallel that I didn't think of to what Zimri writes to Shibtu, that here take these captives and teach them to play our music. Right. That's interesting. So. So here, but here they get these foreign names, right? And I wonder if there were other stories floating around that use these foreign names, and so maybe that's also it's telling us, oh, these other stories are about them. I wonder. Vayasem Daniel alibo asher lo yitga'al b'fat bag hamelech u'biyen mishtav. Right. So Daniel paid attention. Right. He decided that he's not going to make himself filthy with the rations of the king, right? And with the wine from his wine feasts. Vayivakesh misar hasarisim, I should say the wine, probably the wine from his well, whatever. Vayivakesh misar hasarisim, and he asked the head of his officers, that he shouldn't make himself filthy. One assumes he didn't use this language, right? God gave Daniel kindness and mercy before the head of these officers. Vayomer Sarisim Daniel, Yareani et Adoni Hamelech, Asher minat machalchem ve'et mishtechem, Asher lama yiret pnechem zoafim min eladim asher kigilchem. Here we see the other connection in terms of what was the point of the ration, so that they should look healthy, right? Because this officer says to Daniel, he says, listen, I'm sorry, I'm scared of my master, the king, who appointed your food and your drink. Why should he see your faces sad, like not well, as opposed to other children of your age? And you're going to get me in trouble. You're going to get me killed. You know, I'm going to be held responsible by the king. Vayomer Daniel El Hameltzar. Okay, this is interesting. So by the way, Michael Siegel asks, okay, this doesn't make sense because it says God gave him mercy before the chief officer, and then the chief officer says, no, I'm not listening to you. And he proposes that there are verses that were kind of added here, and that these are actually two stories that were combined. And I'll address that a little bit at the end. So, and then Daniel says and in modern Hebrew, we say Hameltzar is the waiter, right? And the reason we say that Hameltzar is a waiter is because of this verse, right? We say this guy is supposed to be bringing him food. Daniel's saying something to him. He's using a word we don't know from anywhere else. So clearly this is a person who's going to bring the food, right? And the answer is not really. So this interpretation is not a modern Hebrew interpretation. It's an interpretation from our first exegetes, our first parshanim, Rashi, etc. Right? That a meltzar is someone who is in charge of food. But actually a meltzar is from minsar, from meitzar, it's a guardian, right? It's someone who's guarding, right? So he said to the guard, right, that the head, the chief of the officers appointed over Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, Azar, yeah? Okay, now we have another person, right? So the chief of the officers, he didn't listen. So Daniel says to the guy who's actually guarding them, right? He's actually in charge of the four of them. Nasna et avadecha yamim asara. He says, look, let's try it for 10 days. 10 days, give us just like seeds to eat and we'll just drink water. He says, and then you can see a look at what we look like compared to the children who are eating the rations of the king. And then according to what you see, then you can what you decide with us. In other words, Daniel's he's realistic. He's like, okay, I get it. I understand that we've got to look healthy, but I'm telling you, let us eat seeds and drink water and not eat this, tray food, right? And you'll see that we're going to look healthy. If they're not going to look healthy, then, what are they going to do, right? So does someone ask, does Yeladim here mean children as in modern Hebrew? Yes. So many echoes of the Yosef story. Yes, absolutely. So there are many echoes here. The Yosef story is also a court story, right? It's also a story of a young man in a foreign court, right? And there's certain patterns and tropes that both of these stories follow, right? You have a young man who's being brought to a strange land. He has to deal with a different culture and different rules. He has to still maintain his own morality or following of laws. And he also has to prove that his God's right? And he's going to be doing that by interpreting dreams. Okay, so there are a lot of parallels here to the Yosef story. So he said, give us a shot, right? And in this case, right, he listened to them, right? So it sounds like the whole thing with the we'll go back to it later in just a sec. But it sounds like the chief of the officer, that whole verse, it doesn't make sense. But now it didn't make sense with God gave him a kind of mercy and mercy before the chief of the officers, but it makes sense in terms of the Meltzar, this guy who's guarding them, right? So he listened to them and he tried it for 10 days. And after the 10 days, they looked good. They looked healthy and fresh. Better than any of the other children who were eating the rations of the king. And so this Meltzar, again, it's so clear that you want to say it's a waiter, right? He's taking food there, he's taking food away, right? He's clearing away the food. You're like, of course he's the waiter. He's supposed to be the guard. So the guard takes away their rations and their wine, and he gives them seeds. But it's not actually seeds, right? It's sort of kind of grain. And these 4 children, God gave wisdom and knowledge in every book and wisdom. And Daniel understood essentially every vision and dream. So they all got wisdom, and Daniel also can understand dreams. And after the days, remember, they're supposed to be 3 years. They're supposed to be in training for 3 years. So the king said to bring them, and the chief officer brings them before Nebuchadnezzar. No, the king didn't find anyone. One assumes didn't find anyone as wise as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they stood before the king. Again, that skipped. Asher b'chol malchuto. All the knowledge of wisdom that he asked from them, he found them 10 times over the magicians and the enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was continued there until the first year of Cyrus. Okay, and this is kind of the prologue in a way. In our next story, right, we're going to have, and I'm not going to it now, I know we've gotten to the end of our time. In our next story, we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar. So it says, we have kind of said, okay, he continued there until Koresh, right, until Cyrus, but the next chapter we're going back to what's the next thing that happened under Nebuchadnezzar? And Nebuchadnezzar is dreaming a dream, and he says, he insists that his wise men tell him the dream, not just interpret the dream, but tell him what he dreamed, right? And they're all like, this is completely impossible. We are all going to die. And Daniel comes and saves the day, right? So what do we have here in this first story? This first story does a couple of things. So it seems to be Michael Siegel argues that it's a combination and it's added to, there are certain verses that were added. So for example, you want to understand what the problem is, why it's hard for Daniel to be able to not eat the rations. You also want there's also two stories going on here. One about how they became wise, and the other how Daniel made sure not to eat treif, not to eat non-kosher food, right? And those are two different things that are going on in this story, which is absolutely true. So you could say that God gave them mercy and kindness before the chief of the officers, and so he helped them kind of reach, he helped them on the way. And then once they were done with the 3 years, they were really wise, right? Or you could say, well, God helped, and that's one story. And the other story is that Daniel was able to convince the guy in charge of them to let them not eat the rations and eat kind of garbage food instead. And yet they were still healthy, which of course is miraculous, right? So that those two things, but they both kind of, in a way, encapsulate these the different challenges of a court story, right? So court story, what's the story? Is you've got Jews in the diaspora, and you're like, how are we going to handle this situation? What is going to happen? Now, I'm not saying that they're not seeing themselves necessarily as Daniel, but they are seeing it as this is a model, right, of how you need to be, right? You need to trust that you're going to be able to keep these rules, right? To keep like kosher, right? And do what you can to keep kosher. And you're also, because God is helping you, you are also going to need to succeed and be wise and show the foreign rulers that who's really God, right? You are going, not just you, and this is your hero, right? Your hero is the one who manages to stay pure, not to make himself filthy, quote unquote, which is the way it's described here, not to make himself filthy with non-kosher food, and at the same time to show that to be able to achieve even greater heights of wisdom. Now, of course, the reason he can achieve greater heights of wisdom is because God is helping him, right? God is helping him, and through this wisdom that he's achieved, he is going to show these foreign rulers that Israel's God is the God, right? And that's what these stories are going to play through, right? And that's how to be. It's kind of how to be a diaspora Jew. That's what I think. This is how to be a Jew in the diaspora. You're supposed to try keep the stuff and show that our God is the God. And part of the way you show that is by being kind of the wisest and being super useful to the king. I mean, we see that this is a path that diaspora Jews take. I mean, and I know I always like Nehemiah is kind of my hero. That's a path Nehemiah takes, right? Nehemiah is in Babylonia. He is the right-hand man to the king, and he uses that position to be able to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, right? That's how, until then, no Persian king would allow it because, we're a crappy, rebellious people. But he's like, listen, how can I be here when my city lies in ruins? And Artaxerxes lets him go. Right? Lets him go and rebuild the city, right? So this is a model, right? It's not just, what I want to say is it's not just a court. It's not just a story. It's not just a story. You can say, oh, but it happened. Why do we need to read this story? I think that's the impact of the story for the Jews who are now in the diaspora, right? This is what it is to be a diaspora Jew. Note that there's no concept that Daniel's waiting for the second he can go back to Israel, right? He's in the diaspora. That's where he is. He was taken to the king's court. This is where he lives now. This is his life, right? He's not doing this. He's not like, oh, I'm going to have a jailbreak or anything like that. This used to bother me very much as a kid when I had that little girl who tells, was it Naaman, that he can get cured from his leprosy by going to Elisha. It always bugged me because it's this little Jewish slave girl and she's never going home. She's helping her master get cured of leprosy. She remembers the prophet from home and she's never going home, right? But this is the idea. The idea is these are Jews in the diaspora. This is it. This is your life. You're in the diaspora. Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king, right? You're the one, he's the guy you're serving. He's the guy you're helping. He's the king, right? So that's also a big part of the whole kind of context of this story, where it's very much this is how we live. If I think of a lot of the book of Second Maccabees, where it's kind of told of like, hey, you know, or not even where there's this idea of like, yeah, some of us live in the diaspora. That's kind of the way it works, you know, and we manage. So that's, I hope that this kind of introduction to the book of Daniel was good. We're going to continue to delve deeper in our next class. I'm going to talk more about kind of court stories in general, other stories like Achikar, which we don't read a lot, and we'll continue on with the visions, which are of course a little bit more typical of the Daniel stories. Great. So everyone, thank you for joining me. I'm really thrilled to be starting a new series, and I hope most of you continue with me.